Dakota Territory, 1883. While every homesteader clearing their claim was cutting down dead trees the moment they saw them, one Norwegian immigrant did the opposite. He built his 16 by 20-foot cabin just 30 feet from a dead cottonwood over 70 feet tall. His neighbors couldn't believe it. The local land agent called it reckless negligence. They warned him the snag would fall through his roof or attract lightning straight to his family. Standard frontier wisdom was clear. Dead trees were widow-makers. You cut him down immediately. But he left it standing, claiming the tall trunk would draw strikes away from lower structures. Then June 17th arrived. A dry thunderstorm rolled across the Opa Plains with winds over 40 miles per hour. 3 cabins in the valley caught fire that night from lightning strikes. Metal stovepipes became conductors. Cedar shake roofs ignited in under 90 seconds. But his cabin? Untouched. Witnesses saw lightning walk down the dead tree, stripping bark in vertical scars, while the structure beside it remained perfectly safe. What did he understand about height, conductivity, and natural grounding that everyone else had dismissed as foolishness? If you respect stories of practical wisdom that stood against conventional thinking, make sure to subscribe. We've got more documented accounts worth remembering. Comment your city and time so we know where this found you. On the morning of May 12, 1883, a Norwegian immigrant named Lars Eriksson stood at the edge of his newly claimed homestead in the Dakota Territory, studying a dead cottonwood that rose more than 70 feet into the empty sky. The tree had been standing there for years, its bark weathered gray, its branches long since fallen away. Every neighbor who passed by told him the same thing: cut it down before it kills you. Dead trees were widow-makers on the frontier. They fell without warning in high winds, crushed cabins, and attracted lightning like a flag drawn to flame. The standard practice was clear and universal. Clear your land, remove the snags, build in open ground where nothing could fall on your roof or channel a strike to your doorstep. But Eriksson had grown up in timber country along the Norwegian coast, where storms came in hard off the water, and lightning was a regular feature of summer weather. He had worked logging crews and carpentry jobs before crossing the Atlantic, and he had learned something that most Dakota homesteaders had never considered. Dead does not always mean dry. Cottonwood and pine, especially trees that had stood for decades, retained moisture deep in their trunks and root systems. They drew minerals up from the soil over years of growth, and those minerals increased conductivity. More importantly, height mattered. Lightning sought the tallest, easiest path to ground, and a 70-foot tree standing alone on flat prairie was exactly that path. If positioned correctly, a tall snag could act as a natural lightning rod, drawing strikes away from lower structures and dissipating energy harmlessly into the earth through its spreading root system. Eriksson measured the distance from the tree to his planned cabin site 3 times, 30 feet, close enough that the tree would dominate the electrical field during a storm, far enough that even if the trunk split and fell, it would land short of the walls. He marked the cabin corners with stakes driven into the prairie sod and began cutting timber from a stand of pine 2 miles upriver. The cabin would be 16 feet by 20 feet, built from hewn logs 9 inches thick, with a roof pitch of 10 inches rise for every 12 inches of run. He planned to cover it with hand-split cedar shakes, the same material every other settler used. But he would not run a metal stovepipe through the peak. Instead, he would build a stone chimney with its own grounding path, keeping conductive materials away from the roof structure entirely. By mid-June, the frame was up and the walls were rising. Neighbors stopped by to watch the work and to repeat their warnings. A land agent named William Marsh, who had been tasked with inspecting claims and encouraging rapid settlement, visited on the afternoon of June 9th. He stood beside the dead cottonwood, looked up at its height, and shook his head. "You're building a disaster," he said plainly. "That tree is going to come down in the first strong wind, or it's going to take a lightning strike and burn your whole claim to ash. Either way, you're risking your family for no reason." Erickson did not argue. He simply pointed out that the tree had stood through every storm for the past 5 years, that its roots were deep and stable, and that he had seen similar trees in Norway act as natural conductors without causing harm. Marsh dismissed the comparison. Norway was not Dakota, and old-world experience did not translate to open prairie. The agent wrote a note in his inspection log that the claim showed poor judgment in site selection. Other homesteaders were less formal, but equally certain. A man named George Callahan, who had built his own cabin a quarter-mile south, stopped by in late June and gestured toward the snag. "You know that thing is going to fall, right?" he asked. "I cleared every dead tree off my claim the first week. That's what you do out here. You clear the land, you build fast, and you don't leave hazards standing." Erickson nodded, but did not change course. He had made his decision based on observation and experience, and he was willing to let the outcome speak for itself. The cabin was finished by early July. The walls were chinked with clay and prairie grass, the roof was tight, and the stone fireplace vented cleanly through a flue built into the center of the structure rather than against an exterior wall. The dead cottonwood stood exactly 28 feet from the north wall, its trunk still solid at the base, its height unchanged. Erickson's wife, Anna, asked him once if he was certain about leaving the tree. He told her he was. She trusted him, but she also kept a cautious eye on the sky whenever thunderheads built on the western horizon. By midsummer, the mockery had become routine. Settlers passing through the valley would point out the snag to newcomers as an example of what not to do. "That Norwegian doesn't know any better," they would say. "He'll learn when that tree comes down." The term "fool's cabin" began circulating in quiet conversations, though no one used it to Erickson's face. He was a competent builder and a hard worker, and most people respected that, even if they thought his judgment was fatally flawed. The community waited, certain that vindication was only a matter of time. A strong wind, a lightning storm, a structural failure, something would prove them right. The cabin stood, the tree stood, and summer storms began to roll across the territory with increasing frequency. The test was coming, though no one yet knew how definitive it would be. The evening of June 17, 1883, began with still air and a sky that turned yellow-gray as the sun dropped toward the horizon. By 8 o'clock, a dry thunderstorm was building over the western plains, pushing east with winds that would later be estimated at over 40 miles per hour. These storms carried no rain, only static charge and lightning that could ignite anything it touched. Settlers across the valley watched the clouds roll in and made quick decisions about whether to stay inside or move livestock to lower ground. Most cabins had no lightning protection of any kind. A few had metal stovepipes that ran through cedar shake roofs, creating accidental pathways for electrical current, but no grounding to carry it safely away. The standard frontier construction method prioritized speed and simplicity over considerations that seemed theoretical until the moment they became critical. The first strike hit George Callahan's cabin at approximately 9:15. Witnesses a half-mile away described a blue-white flash, followed immediately by the sound of splitting wood. The lightning traveled down the iron stovepipe, jumped to the dry roof beams, and ignited the cedar shakes in under 90 seconds. Callahan and his wife escaped with their children, but the structure was a total loss by the time neighbors arrived. The fire spread too quickly to contain, fed by pitch-soaked timbers and a roof that had been baking under summer sun for 2 months. By 10 o'clock, 2 more cabins in the valley had caught fire from separate strikes. The storm moved through the region for nearly 3 hours, and the damage it left behind would be documented in territorial weather logs as one of the most destructive lightning events of the decade. At the Erickson homestead, the storm arrived with the same intensity. Anna Erickson gathered the children inside and moved away from the windows, while Lars stood near the door, watching the dead cottonwood that rose 70 feet into the charged air. The first strike came just after 9:30. Lightning found the top of the snag and traveled straight down the trunk in a single vertical path. The sound was immediate and sharp, like a rifle shot amplified 100 times. Bark exploded off the tree in long strips, some of them 6 to 10 feet in length, peeling away from the trunk and falling to the ground in smoking fragments. The energy moved downward through the wood, following the path of least resistance, and dissipated into the root system that spread outward through damp subsoil. The cabin, 30 feet away, remained untouched. No side flash jumped the gap. No current traveled through the ground to the stone foundation. The strike was absorbed and grounded exactly as Erickson had predicted it would be. Anna came to the door and looked at the tree, then at her husband. "It worked," she said quietly. He nodded but did not speak. The storm was not finished. Over the next 2 hours, lightning continued to walk across the valley, striking isolated high points and metal objects with mechanical predictability. The dead cottonwood took 2 more direct hits before midnight. Each time the same pattern repeated. Vertical path, bark stripped away, energy dissipated into the roots. Each time the cabin remained safe. By dawn, when the wind finally dropped and the sky cleared, 3 cabins in the valley had burned to the ground. The Erickson homestead showed no damage beyond the scarred trunk of the tree that had drawn the strikes away. George Callahan came to the Erickson cabin the following afternoon. His family had sheltered with neighbors overnight, and he was beginning the process of planning a rebuild. He stood in front of the dead cottonwood and studied the vertical scars where bark had been blown away. The wood underneath was darker than the outer layers, still damp in places despite the tree having been dead for years. "I thought you were crazy," Callahan said. "I told people you were building next to a bomb." Erickson walked over and placed his hand on the trunk. The surface was warm from the sun, but structurally sound. "Dead does not mean dry," he said. "This tree still has moisture in the core. It still has minerals from years of growth. Lightning wants the tallest path to ground, and this tree gave it that path 3 times last night. If it had not been here, the strike might have found my roof instead." Word spread quickly through the valley. The Norwegian, who had been mocked for leaving a widowmaker standing, had survived a storm that destroyed 3 cabins and damaged 2 more. The dead tree that everyone had called a hazard had taken multiple lightning strikes without transferring energy to the structure beside it. By the end of June, settlers were asking questions instead of offering warnings. Some began walking their own claims, looking at tall trees they had planned to cut down, reconsidering whether removal was always the safest choice. The local land agent, William Marsh, did not visit again, but he stopped writing notes about poor site selection in his inspection logs. The summer of 1883 became the first year of a broader pattern. Between 1882 and 1886, the Dakota Territory experienced an unusually high frequency of severe thunderstorms, many of them dry lightning events that ignited structures without providing rain to extinguish the fires. Territorial weather records documented an average of 1 lightning strike per square mile per storm system in exposed prairie zones. Cabins without grounding continued to burn. Homesteaders who had cleared every tall tree from their land found themselves the highest point on flat ground when storms arrived. The losses mounted slowly but consistently, and the contrast between protected and unprotected structures became impossible to ignore. Erickson's cabin remained untouched through every storm, and the dead cottonwood continued to absorb strikes season after season, its trunk growing more scarred but still standing, still grounded, still doing exactly what he had understood it would do from the beginning. By the fall of 1883, neighbors who had once dismissed Lars Eriksson's decision were beginning to ask him direct questions about how the dead cottonwood actually worked. The mechanism was not immediately obvious to most settlers, who thought of dead trees simply as falling hazards or fire risks. The idea that a standing snag could function as a protective feature required understanding principles that were not part of standard frontier education. Eriksson explained it in the most practical terms he could, drawing on what he had learned in Norwegian timber country and what he had observed firsthand during the June storm. The first principle was moisture retention. A dead tree, especially one that had been standing for several years, was not uniformly dry throughout its structure. Cottonwood and pine both retained significant moisture in their inner cores, even after the outer bark had weathered and the branches had fallen away. The trunk acted like a vertical reservoir, with water stored in the deeper layers of wood and minerals concentrated from decades of growth. When lightning struck, it followed the path of least resistance, and moisture combined with mineral content created a conductive channel that was far more attractive than the surrounding air or nearby wooden structures. This was the reason the strikes traveled straight down the trunk rather than jumping sideways toward the cabin. The second principle was height. On flat prairie, a 70-foot tree created a natural upward leader that connected with the descending stepped leader from the storm cloud. Lightning did not strike randomly. It followed predictable electrical pathways, seeking the tallest, most conductive point available. The dead cottonwood was the highest object in a half-mile radius, and that height gave it a massive advantage in drawing strikes away from lower structures. A cabin with a roof peak at 12 feet had no chance of competing for a strike when a tree 7 times that height stood nearby. The electrical field during a storm naturally concentrated around the tallest point, and the cabin fell outside that concentration zone as long as it was positioned correctly. The third principle was grounding. A tree that had been rooted in place for decades had a root system that spread outward in all directions, often extending as far underground as the tree was tall above ground. When lightning energy traveled down the trunk and into the roots, it dissipated through damp soil across a wide area. The soil round the cottonwood base showed visible evidence of this dissipation, cracks radiating outward 3 to 5 feet from the trunk, caused by the explosive expansion of moisture when the strike delivered energy into the ground. This natural grounding system was far more effective than anything a settler could build by hand. Metal rods driven into dry soil could provide some protection, but they lacked the distributed root network that carried energy away from a central point. George Callahan, whose cabin had burned in the June storm, asked Eriksson to walk the distance from the tree to the cabin wall and explain why 30 feet was the right spacing. Eriksson marked the distance with stakes and pointed out that the gap was wide enough to prevent side flash, the lateral jump of electrical current from one conductive object to another, but close enough that the tree dominated the electrical field during a storm. Side flash typically occurred when 2 conductive objects were within 10 to 15 feet of each other, and even then, it required specific conditions. Wood was not a strong conductor compared to metal or water, so a wooden cabin at 30 feet was effectively isolated from the strike path as long as the tree provided a better route to ground. If the cabin had been built 10 feet from the tree, the risk would have increased significantly. At 50 feet, the tree would still draw strikes, but the cabin might begin to compete for attention depending on wind direction and storm intensity. A second-wave settler named Tom Brennan, who had arrived in the valley in late 1883, asked whether the method worked with any dead tree or only with cottonwood. Eriksson told him it worked best with trees that had deep root systems and high moisture retention, which generally meant cottonwood, pine, and certain types of oak. Shallow-rooted trees like aspen or willow would not ground as effectively. Completely dry snags with rotted-out cores would not conduct as reliably. The tree had to be structurally sound enough to remain standing, tall enough to dominate the surrounding area, and rooted deeply enough to dissipate energy into the soil. Brennan asked about green trees, whether a living cottonwood would work even better. Erickson said it might, but green trees came with different risks. They could still fall in high winds, their branches could break and damage roofs, and they required maintenance to prevent overgrowth. A dead snag, properly selected, was stable, required no trimming, and would stand for decades if the trunk remained solid. The conversation turned to practical adoption. Callahan was preparing to rebuild his cabin and asked whether he should leave a tall pine standing on his new claim. Erickson walked the site with him and identified a pine roughly 60 feet tall, standing on a slight rise about 40 feet from where Callahan planned to build. The tree was dead, but still firmly rooted, with visible moisture in the inner bark when Erickson stripped a small section to check. He told Callahan the placement would work if the cabin was sited downslope and far enough away to avoid falling distance. The pine would act as a natural lightning rod, just as the cottonwood had, and the elevated position would give it an even stronger advantage in drawing strikes. Callahan marked the site and began cutting timber for the new structure, this time leaving the snag standing instead of clearing it. By the winter of 1883, the method was no longer theoretical. The June storm had provided clear evidence that tall, dead trees could protect nearby structures, and settlers who had lost cabins were now asking how to replicate the approach. Erickson never lectured or promoted the technique openly. He answered questions when asked, demonstrated the spacing and root principles when neighbors visited, and allowed the outcomes to speak for themselves. The dead cottonwood beside his cabin continued to show scars from multiple strikes, but it remained standing, and the cabin remained untouched. What had looked like reckless negligence in May had become a reference point by December, and the shift happened quietly, without fanfare or formal acknowledgement. The frontier was beginning to understand what Erickson had known from the start, that survival often depended not on clearing the land completely, but on reading what the land was already doing and using it strategically. The summer of 1884 brought another cycle of severe thunderstorms to the Dakota Territory, and this time the community was watching the dead cottonwood beside the Erickson cabin with open attention rather than hidden mockery. The tree had survived the previous year with visible scars, but no structural failure, and settlers who had rebuilt after losing cabins in 1883 were now implementing variations of the method on their own claims. George Callahan had left a tall pine standing 40 feet from his new cabin, positioned on a slight rise to increase its height advantage. Tom Brennan, building his first homestead in the valley, had sited his structure 35 feet downslope from a dead cottonwood and kept the root zone moist by digging a shallow drainage channel that directed runoff toward the tree base. Others simply stopped clearing every snag from their land and began evaluating which trees might serve a protective function rather than pose a falling hazard. The turning point came on the evening of July 9, 1884. A massive storm system moved across the territory with lightning frequency that exceeded anything recorded the previous year. Strikes were visible every few seconds, illuminating the prairie in bursts of white light that left afterimages burned into the vision of anyone watching. The wind carried the smell of ozone, burning grass, and the temperature dropped 15 degrees in less than an hour as the storm front passed overhead. At the Erickson homestead, the dead cottonwood took multiple strikes over the course of 3 hours. Neighbors sheltering in their own cabins could see the flashes from a mile away, and several later reported that the tree seemed to glow briefly after each strike, as if the energy was radiating outward before dissipating into the ground. One strike, recorded in local accounts as the most violent of the night, split the cottonwood nearly to its roots. The trunk cracked vertically with a sound that carried across the valley, and a section of the outer wood separated from the core, exposing the interior layers that were still damp despite years of standing dead. The split ran from 20 feet above ground down to the root crown, and the base of the tree showed fused sand and cracked soil in a radius of nearly 5 feet, evidence of the massive energy discharge into the earth. The cabin, 28 feet away, remained completely undamaged. No side flash occurred, no fire ignited. The roof shakes were dry and vulnerable. The stone chimney was cold, and the structure showed no sign that it had been within 30 feet of a lightning strike powerful enough to split a 70-foot tree nearly in half. By dawn, neighbors began arriving at the Erickson homestead to see the damage. The cottonwood was still standing, though its structural integrity had been compromised by the vertical split. Erickson walked around the base and studied the cracks in the soil, noting how the energy had spread outward through the root system rather than concentrating in a single point. The tree had done exactly what he had understood it would do. It had provided a preferred path to ground, absorbed energy that would otherwise have sought the nearest available target, and protected the cabin through multiple strikes without failing catastrophically. Anna Erickson stood on the cabin porch and watched the neighbors inspect the tree. "They thought you were a fool," she said quietly. Lars nodded. "They were certain," he replied, "and now they are asking questions instead." The shift in community perception was immediate and practical. Callahan reported that his new cabin, built with a tall pine left standing upslope, had survived the same storm without incident. The pine had taken at least 2 visible strikes, leaving bark stripped away in vertical patterns identical to those on the Erickson cottonwood. Brennan's cabin, sited near a second dead cottonwood with a moistened root zone, also remained untouched despite lightning striking the tree multiple times. The contrast between protected and unprotected structures was now undeniable. Cabins built in cleared fields with no tall trees nearby and no grounding beyond accidental metal stovepipes continued to suffer fire damage and total losses. Cabins built near strategically positioned snags were surviving storms that should have destroyed them. By late summer, the method had spread beyond immediate neighbors. Settlers building new claims began walking their land before clearing it, identifying tall dead trees with solid trunks and deep root systems, and planning cabin sites based on spacing and elevation relative to those trees. Some went further, implementing makeshift grounding improvements by burying iron chains or metal rods from the tree base into wet soil, attempting to replicate the natural root spread with manufactured conductors. These additions were hit or miss. Some worked well, others failed because the metal was not buried deeply enough or the soil was too dry to conduct effectively. But the principle had taken hold. The idea that a dead tree could be a protective feature rather than a hazard was no longer a strange Norwegian notion. It was becoming standard practice. The local land agent, William Marsh, visited the valley again in September of 1884. He inspected several new claims and noted the prevalence of tall snags left standing near cabin sites. When he reached the Erickson homestead, he stood in front of the split cottonwood and studied the vertical scar that ran from crown to roots. "I told you this was reckless," he said. Erickson did not respond immediately. He walked over to the tree and placed his hand on the split trunk, feeling the dampness still present in the inner wood. "You told me the tree would fall or burn my cabin," he said finally. "It has taken more than a dozen direct strikes in 2 years, and my cabin has not been touched once. If that is reckless, then I do not understand the word." Marsh did not argue further. He wrote a note in his log that natural lightning protection was being adopted across the valley, and that fire losses had decreased measurably compared to the previous decade. It was as close to an acknowledgement as Erickson would receive from official sources. By the winter of 1884, the Fool's Cabin had become a landmark. Travelers passing through the valley were told the story of the Norwegian who left a widowmaker standing and proved the entire settlement wrong. The dead cottonwood, now visibly damaged but still upright, stood as physical evidence that frontier assumptions could be tested and overturned by applied knowledge. Erickson never lectured about the method. He answered questions when asked, walked new claims with neighbors who wanted advice on tree selection and spacing, and continued to maintain his own homestead with the same practical attention to detail that had guided his original decision. The community had moved from mockery to adoption in less than 2 years, and the shift had happened not through persuasion, but through outcomes that could not be dismissed or explained away. The method that Lars Erickson had introduced to the Dakota Territory in 1883 did not remain isolated to a single valley or a handful of homesteads. By the mid-1880s, settlers across the upper plains were beginning to reconsider how they cleared their land and where they positioned their structures relative to tall trees. The shift happened quietly, passed along through direct observation and neighbor-to-neighbor conversation, rather than through formal instruction or published guides. Frontier manuals continued to recommend clearing dead timber as a safety measure, but practical experience was overriding written advice in regions where lightning storms were frequent and destructive. The outcomes were simply too clear to ignore. Cabins built near tall, well-rooted snags survived storms that destroyed structures in open clearings, and the pattern repeated across enough seasons that it became accepted wisdom among those who had witnessed it firsthand. The split cottonwood beside the Erickson cabin remained standing through the rest of the 1880s, taking additional strikes each summer and absorbing energy that would otherwise have sought lower targets. The vertical crack that had opened during the July 1884 storm never fully closed, but the tree did not fall. Its root system held firm, anchored deep in soil that had been stabilized by decades of growth, and the trunk retained enough structural integrity to remain upright despite visible damage. By 1890, the tree had become a landmark referenced in land descriptions and claim paperwork. New settlers arriving in the valley were told the story as a matter of course, and many walked out to see the scarred trunk for themselves, studying the patterns of bark removal and the fused soil at the base where repeated strikes had discharged into the ground. George Callahan, who had lost his first cabin in the June 1883 storm, kept detailed records of lightning activity on his rebuilt homestead over the next decade. His notes, preserved in a family journal that later made its way into county historical archives, documented 17 separate strikes on the tall pine he had left standing upslope from his cabin between 1884 and 1894. The pine showed progressive damage similar to the Erickson cottonwood, bark stripped in vertical sections, wood darkened and split in places, but the tree remained standing and the cabin remained protected. Callahan recorded 0 fire losses during that period, a stark contrast to the total loss he had suffered before adopting the method. His journal included sketches of the tree's position relative to the cabin, measurements of spacing and elevation difference, and notes on root zone moisture levels during different seasons. The documentation was practical rather than theoretical, focused entirely on what worked and what could be replicated by others. Tom Brennan, who had built his homestead with a dead cottonwood positioned 35 feet upslope, went a step further in attempting to improve the natural grounding system. In the spring of 1886, he buried a series of iron chains from the tree base into a drainage channel he had dug to carry runoff away from his cabin. The chains extended roughly 20 feet into wet soil, creating additional conductive pathways that supplemented the tree's root system. The modification appeared to work. Strikes continued to favor the cottonwood over the cabin, and Brennan observed that the soil around the buried chains showed similar cracking patterns to the soil around the tree roots, suggesting the metal was carrying energy away from the central strike point. Other settlers attempted similar improvements with varying levels of success. Iron rods driven into dry soil often failed to conduct effectively, while chains buried in naturally damp ground seemed to enhance the protective effect. The experiments were informal and uncontrolled, but they demonstrated a willingness to build on the original method rather than simply copying it without modification. The knowledge that informed Ericsson's original decision had deeper roots than most settlers understood. Plains native communities had been managing their relationship with lightning for generations before European settlement, and their approach to site selection reflected accumulated observation passed down through oral tradition. A Lakota elder named Chinumpa, who traded occasionally with settlers in the region, explained to a mixed heritage interpreter in 1887 that his people had always understood tall, isolated trees as protectors rather than hazards. They positioned temporary camps and permanent lodges near large cottonwoods or pines when possible, especially in open country where storms could build quickly. The trees were seen as channels that carried sky energy safely into the earth, and their presence was considered favorable rather than dangerous. This knowledge had circulated indirectly through trappers, traders, and scouts for decades, but it had not been widely credited or adopted by settlers until men like Ericsson demonstrated the same principles through direct application and measurable outcomes. By the early 1900s, manufactured lightning rods were becoming more affordable and accessible through mail-order catalogs and regional suppliers. Copper rods with grounding cables offered a standardized solution that did not depend on finding the right tree or maintaining root zone moisture. Many homesteaders began installing these systems as they became available, and the use of natural conductors gradually declined as manufactured alternatives took over. But the transition took decades, and in remote areas where purchasing and installing copper systems was prohibitively expensive, tall snags continued to serve as primary lightning protection well into the 1920s. Some homesteads retained their original snags even after installing manufactured rods, either as backup systems or simply because the trees had become part of the established landscape and no one saw a reason to remove them. The Ericsson homestead changed hands in 1906 when Lars and Anna moved to live with their daughter's family in Minnesota. The new owners, a family named Sorensen, kept the property largely as they found it, including the dead cottonwood that still stood beside the cabin despite more than 2 decades of lightning strikes. The tree finally fell during a windstorm in 1912, its trunk weakened beyond recovery by accumulated damage. By that time, the cabin had stood for 29 years without a single fire loss, and the protective function of the snag had been documented in county records and family journals that would eventually find their way into historical archives. The story became part of regional folklore, told and retold with varying degrees of accuracy, but the core facts remained consistent. A Norwegian immigrant had understood something about lightning and natural grounding that his neighbors had dismissed as foolishness, and the outcomes had proven him right season after season, storm after storm, strike after strike. On the frontier, survival often belonged not to the man who cleared the land fastest, but to the one who understood what the land was already doing and used it strategically. That principle, demonstrated through a single dead cottonwood left standing when everyone else was cutting theirs down, quietly changed how an entire region approached site selection and lightning protection. The method spread without fanfare, adopted by settlers who cared more about outcomes than theories, and it remained in use long enough to overlap with the arrival of manufactured systems that would eventually replace it. But for more than 3 decades, the approach worked. And it worked because someone had paid attention to old knowledge, tested it under frontier conditions, and let the results speak for themselves.